I'm staring at the massive SUV blocking my driveway. I can't even pull out for groceries. This isn't the first time, but it's definitely the final straw. My name's Ethan, and if you've ever dealt with neighbors who think your property is their personal parking lot, this story's for you. Before we dive into the chaos, let me know in the comments below, where are you watching from? Because things are about to get wild. Buckle up and enjoy yourselves. I wake up the next morning half expecting to see that SUV still perched outside like some immovable monument to neighborhood tyranny. My driveway is mercifully clear. I'm not the type who likes confrontation, yet I can't let people walk all over me either. That's precisely the sense of frustration I feel boiling up now. Our suburban enclave looks peaceful to outsiders. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, kids riding bikes along sidewalks. But beneath that pleasant exterior lurks a homeowners association that some might describe as draconian. The rules here are endless, covering every detail from mailbox height to the color of the annual holiday lights. I never expected to love those regulations, but I also didn't expect them to be used against me, turning me into a prisoner in my own garage. It all started when Karen, a member of the HOA board, decided my driveway was the perfect place for her monstrous SUV. She's known for dishing out violation notices for the slightest infraction. Grass a bit too long? You get a letter. A small garden gnome that doesn't match community aesthetics? That's another citation. She relishes every bit of power the HOA grants her, so you can imagine how she reacted when I asked her to move her vehicle. In short, she refused, citing some murky clause that supposedly gave her the right to park there. "Excuse me," I said, attempting politeness, "but you're blocking my driveway." She shot back a bored look, as if I were the one at fault for daring to need access to my own garage. When she finally moved her SUV, she did so at a crawl, letting me know I was an inconvenience in her grand day. I didn't think much of it then, hoping it was a one-time incident, but it became the first of many. At first, I thought I could handle it with polite conversation. I approached Karen calmly and pointed out that her truck blocked my driveway entirely. She didn't care. Instead, she looked me in the eye and told me I should post a no parking sign if I didn't like it, as if that sign would magically undo her brazen disregard for other people's property. Then I tried contacting the local police. They said it was a civil matter or suggested I hire a tow truck on my own. When I approached the HOA, they brushed me off, muttering something about shared streets. Obviously, they were covering for Karen. Usually, HOAs exist to maintain a pleasant environment, ensuring that houses look tidy and neighbors keep their lawns neat. That's all fine and good, until you meet people who weaponize those rules for personal vendettas. In my case, Karen was one of the more prominent board members, notorious for her rule enforcement. Stories circulated about her snapping pictures of people's lawns if the grass was too long, or leaving hostile notes on doors whenever she judged someone's paint color to be too bold. Despite the rumors, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just thorough, maybe she was misunderstood. Then I learned firsthand that some rumors hold more truth than we'd like. The day she parked on my driveway for the second time, I approached her again. This time her reaction was even more dismissive. She claimed there was no sign saying no parking. She also implied that a portion of the driveway near the street might be considered community property, though that was a shaky interpretation of the HOA's guidelines. When it became clear she had no intention of stopping this behavior, I reached out to the HOA, thinking they'd step in. After all, wasn't blocking a driveway a violation of basic courtesy, if not an actual law? The response from the HOA stunned me. They brushed it off, said it was a neighborly dispute, and suggested I clarify boundaries with Karen directly. It felt like they were protecting her. I wondered if it was because she was on the board. Growing irritated, I also tried calling the local police non-emergency line. They told me that while parking in front of a public curb isn't necessarily illegal unless signage says otherwise, blocking a private driveway could be a violation if it extended past a certain point. The problem was, every time I tried to get a photo or evidence, Karen moved her car just far enough to make it a gray area. It was maddening. My wife, Taylor, advised me to pick my battles. She said, "Don't let Karen ruin our peace. Maybe put up a polite sign or something." But my patience was wearing thin. I felt singled out. Why would Karen repeatedly choose my driveway? Was she testing me? Or was it simply the most convenient spot from which to harass the rest of the street? The tension took a toll. I found myself peeking out the window every morning, dreading the sight of her SUV. That's when I confided in our neighbor, Mary. She's lived here longer and has her own stories of Karen's overreach. Mary once received a formal complaint from the HOA about having a bird feeder that supposedly attracted pests. Shortly after that complaint, Karen prided herself on patrolling the area for such violations. It didn't take a detective to figure out who ratted Mary out. So when I mentioned the driveway situation, Mary's eyebrows shot up. "You might be her new target," Mary warned. "She's done this before with other neighbors. Pushes them to see how much they'll tolerate." I asked Mary why the HOA wouldn't stand up to Karen. She shrugged. "She's got connections. Half the board is either her friend or too wary to cross her. Some people think that if they keep their heads down, Karen will leave them alone." That passivity struck a nerve. I wasn't about to let someone walk all over me in my own neighborhood. I decided then and there that I needed a strategy, something that was legal, creative, and bulletproof. A memory clicked. I once had a conversation with an old friend who was a civil engineer. He mentioned that in certain municipalities, installing a shallow ornamental water feature might not require special permits if it met depth and boundary requirements. That got me thinking in a bizarre direction. What if I created a barrier that physically prevented Karen or anyone from parking on my driveway? A fence was too obvious, and the HOA might find a rule against it. But a mini-moat around my driveway, complete with a small bridge, sounded so outlandish it just might fit within the guidelines, if done correctly. At first I laughed off the idea. A moat in suburbia? I pictured medieval castles, drawbridges, knights in armor. Then I realized that a well-landscaped water feature could pass as decorative, if I stayed within the rules. Proper distance from the sidewalk, correct depth, no flooding potential. I might be able to pull it off. Yes, it would be expensive, but so was my ever-rising blood pressure from dealing with Karen's antics. Maybe it was worth it. Taylor, upon hearing the plan, stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "A moat, Ethan? Are you serious?" she asked, torn between amusement and concern. I assured her I was dead serious. This is the kind of solution that Karen can't weasel out of, I reasoned. She can't park on a driveway that has a water barrier around it. Taylor shook her head, half laughing. "Only you would turn our front yard into a medieval fortress," she teased. But I could tell she was warming to the idea, especially when we talked about how it might even look nice if done tastefully. Next, I made some calls to the local city planning office. I was careful with my words, describing my idea as a decorative shallow pond around the perimeter of my driveway with a small crossing for vehicle access. The official rules stated that if it was under a certain depth, often around 2 feet, I wouldn't need special permits. As for safety concerns, I'd need a stable structure if I wanted any sort of bridging mechanism. I hung up feeling both daunted and emboldened. Mary thought the plan was hilarious, but volunteered to help me gather any local horticultural advice. She had a green thumb and suggested aquatic plants that could thrive in shallow water. While the concept of a moat seemed insane, I found genuine enthusiasm as I sketched out possible layouts. The more I planned, the more determined I became. That determination hardened when Karen upped her game. One evening I returned home to find not only her SUV, but also a note taped to my door. It read, "Your property boundary is misleading and your driveway isn't clearly marked as private. Next time, I won't move my car so quickly." The nerve. It felt like a direct threat. You're not safe in your own driveway. That's when I decided to move from idea to action. I spoke to Dave, my civil engineer friend, explaining I wanted to dig a shallow trench around the driveway's sides and install a discreet mechanical bridge at the entrance. Dave thought it was brilliant, or, as he put it, the wildest thing I've ever helped design in a residential setting. We spent late nights finalizing the blueprint, a moat that would encircle the driveway, shallow but wide enough to be a deterrent. In front, near the street, we'd install an automatic bridge that could lift or pivot, allowing my car to cross. Dave made sure we stayed within local regulations, safe distances from utility lines, correct drainage, and compliance with any water use policies. The next hurdle was funding. My savings weren't massive, and this project wasn't cheap. But after Karen's repeated harassment, I rationalized it as an investment in peace of mind. Taylor agreed we could dip into a portion of our emergency fund, so long as I didn't let costs spiral out of control. We gathered estimates from local contractors, picked one, and scheduled the start date. I could hardly believe I was paying a crew to build a mini-moat, but sometimes extraordinary problems require extraordinary solutions. Word got around. A few neighbors whispered about the upcoming crazy project at Ethan's place. Some thought I was out of my mind, but several, especially those who'd had run-ins with Karen, found it poetic justice. Mary was my biggest cheerleader, stopping by frequently to see how the construction would progress. Rick, another neighbor fed up with HOA nonsense, offered to help with some basic labor if needed. Karen must have noticed the markings in my yard and the small flags placed by utility services. She slowed her SUV whenever she passed, glaring through the window as if trying to decipher my plan. I made a point of smiling and waving each time, a petty gesture of confidence. I wanted her to know something big was happening, something she couldn't easily stop. On the day construction began, a small team arrived to start digging the trench. They removed a ribbon of sod around the driveway's perimeter, carefully shaping what would become the water channel. It caused quite a stir. Neighbors strolled by, openly curious. Most offered polite greetings. A few asked direct questions, and I explained I was installing a decorative water feature to enhance my property. If they pressed about the moat aspect, I simply smiled, neither confirming nor denying. The mood was almost festive until Karen showed up. She parked across the street, got out, and marched right into my yard. I felt my chest tighten, bracing for a confrontation. She looked at the half-dug trench, then turned to me. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" she demanded, voice trembling with anger. "This is going to destroy our neighborhood aesthetics. I will report this to the HOA immediately." Inwardly, I was prepared. I produced a folder containing all the relevant guidelines. "I'm within my property line," I said evenly. "This trench is under the maximum depth that would require special permits. I have documentation from the city, and I'm using recommended materials for water retention." I tapped a page that showed the official rule from the HOA about water features. No rule explicitly forbade it. Karen's eyes darted across the text, narrowing each time she found no violation. She sputtered. "Well, we'll just see what the board says about this. I'm sure they'll have something to say about the safety hazards." Then she spun on her heel and stalked off. I exhaled, resisting the urge to follow and argue. I'd given her the facts. If she wanted to challenge them, she'd have to face not just me but the documentation I'd carefully assembled. By the end of that week, the trench took shape. We lined it with waterproof materials, installed a simple pump to keep the water circulating, and laid out ornamental stones. The effect was surprisingly pleasant, like a moat in miniature, but with the look of a refined garden feature. The last step was the most crucial, the motorized bridge at the front. Watching the team install the drawbridge mechanism was surreal. It felt like we were building a movie set. Yet, as it came together, I could see the practical function. When lowered, the bridge formed a seamless path for my car. When raised, it left a gap of about 2 feet of water beneath, enough to deter any vehicle from crossing. I tested it a few times, grinning as the small motor lifted the bridge with a quiet hum. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering and pointing. Some were purely entertained, others were impressed by the audacity. Mary was thrilled, snapping pictures to show her friends. "You're going to be a legend in this neighborhood," she said with a laugh. I just nodded, still halfway in disbelief that this was actually happening. Of course, tension simmered beneath the surface. Karen complained to the HOA board, claiming I was constructing a hazardous entrapment structure. In response, I received a stern letter requesting an inspection of my property. I invited them to come any time, confident that everything was legit. When the inspector and a couple of board members arrived, I walked them around, showing them the carefully measured dimensions and how the water wouldn't pose a drowning risk because it was shallow. I demonstrated the automated bridge, which moved slowly enough not to hurt anyone. They scrutinized it all. One of the board members even seemed amused, while the other tried to maintain a stern demeanor. In the end, they found no grounds to stop me. I thought maybe that would end it. But Karen wasn't done. She showed up one afternoon while I was adjusting the water pump, accusing me of causing noise pollution with the motor. I calmly pointed to the decibel rating in the manual, well below the neighborhood's noise limit. She then pivoted to claiming the water might breed mosquitoes. I explained that the pump kept the water circulating, discouraging insect larvae. Every angle she attempted, I had a counter. She eventually left, fuming. That night, I finally slept soundly, believing the moat had triumphed. But it wasn't over yet. The real confrontation was just around the corner. One sunny Saturday, I was in my driveway prepping my car for a weekend trip. I'd just lowered the drawbridge and was loading luggage into the trunk when I saw Karen's SUV rolling toward my property. My pulse quickened. She stopped beside the curb, got out, and strode right onto the lowered bridge, camera phone in hand. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping away from the trunk. She ignored me, muttering something about capturing evidence of a code violation. Without warning, she marched deeper onto my driveway, snapping photos of the moat's interior, the pump setup, and even my car's plates. The audacity was breathtaking. This was my private property, yet she acted as though she had every right to inspect it at will. "Get off my property," I said, my voice tense. "You've already had your inspection with the board." She smirked. "As a concerned resident, I have every right to document potential hazards. This moat is a lawsuit waiting to happen, and I'm making sure everyone knows it." My hand clenched around the remote control for the bridge. Normally it was just for raising and lowering from my car, but there was a manual override as well. I'd set it to a timer. If left down for too long without me pressing a button, it would automatically start to lift, a security feature recommended by Dave. Sure enough, as Karen kept yapping, the safety system kicked in. The bridge gave a soft mechanical whir. Karen froze, feeling the platform start to rise. She was standing near the middle, balancing precariously as the angle shifted. "What's happening?" she shrieked, arms flailing. "Stop this thing!" I dashed to the control panel near the side of the driveway. The motor was already in motion. I quickly pressed the button to pause it. By this point, the bridge was partially lifted, leaving Karen off balance and furious. She staggered toward the edge, nearly dropping her phone into the moat. I considered letting the system continue just to teach her a lesson, but I couldn't bring myself to watch her actually fall. With a beep, the motor halted, leaving the bridge suspended at an awkward angle. "You're insane," Karen hissed, regaining her footing. "You almost dumped me into that filthy water." She stomped toward the end of the partially raised bridge, then hopped onto the ground with an indignant grunt. "I never invited you onto my driveway," I countered, struggling not to laugh at the absurdity. "It's an automated system, and you triggered it by standing there. You're trespassing, Karen." Her face was red and her breathing came in short, angry bursts. She started to say something else, but by now neighbors were gathering. Mary was there, phone in hand, capturing the entire scene. Karen looked around, realizing she had an audience. Her scowl deepened. "This won't stand," she snapped, voice quivering with rage. "I'll see you in court for assault or entrapment or both." With that, she stormed back to her SUV, peeled away, and disappeared around the corner. A wave of relief washed over me, followed by a jab of anxiety. Assault? Entrapment? I knew those accusations wouldn't hold water, no pun intended, but this was Karen. She might try anything. I turned to Mary, who was biting her lip to keep from laughing. "Please tell me you got that on video," I said, half joking. She held up her phone. Every second of it. That was epic. Several neighbors who'd witnessed the scene clapped or shook their heads in amazement. I couldn't tell if they were applauding me for standing up to Karen or just astonished by the moat drama. Either way, I felt a strange combination of triumph and apprehension. Within days, I received notice from the HOA that Karen had filed a formal complaint accusing me of creating a hazardous trap. The letter mentioned possible violations of safety standards, but did not specify any actual code. They requested a hearing with me in attendance. A hearing? Over a moat that was already deemed acceptable. Fine. I gathered every piece of documentation I had, the city's water feature allowances, the HOA's rules, and the video Mary recorded. The night before the hearing, Taylor urged me to remain calm. "Don't lose your temper," she said. "That's exactly what Karen wants. She'll try to provoke you so she can claim you're unhinged." I kissed her on the cheek, grateful for her level-headed advice, and promised I'd keep my composure. When I arrived at the HOA office, a modest building near our community clubhouse, I found a group of board members waiting. Karen was there too, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with vindictive delight. She'd prepared a thick folder of her own, presumably stuffed with contrived accusations. The meeting convened in a small conference room with a single overhead light that made the atmosphere feel strangely like an interrogation. Thomas, the HOA chair, began by outlining the complaint. Karen claims that Ethan's water feature, commonly referred to as a moat, poses a safety risk and violates the spirit of our community guidelines. She also alleges that it was used to entrap her on his property against her will. "Ethan, you have the floor to respond." I inhaled deeply. "Thank you. I'd like to point out that this so-called entrapment was actually an automated safety feature. Karen stepped onto my private driveway without permission, and the bridge's timer initiated. It's the same mechanism I use to ensure no trespasser or stray animal gets stuck there. Once I noticed she was in the middle, I paused the system. At no point did I intend to trap her. I also have video evidence shot by a neutral bystander if anyone wants to see it." One of the board members raised an eyebrow. "Neutral bystander?" "My neighbor Mary," I said. "She can confirm that Karen was filming my property without consent and remained there after the timer began." Karen shifted in her seat. "She's not neutral," she snapped. "She's your friend." "But the footage speaks for itself," I replied, sliding my phone across the table. "Feel free to watch. It'll take only a minute or two." The board members huddled around to watch. Karen glared as the video played, capturing her shrieking as the bridge lifted. I kept my composure, though a part of me was tempted to smirk. The clarity of the footage showed I wasn't near the controls until after the system had already started. I also had logs from the automated system verifying the exact timestamp of the lift. Once the board finished viewing, Thomas cleared his throat. "It appears that the lift was indeed automatic." He turned to Karen. "You described a scenario where Ethan intentionally activated the bridge to trap you, but from this video, it looks more like you were trespassing and the device was triggered by a timer." Karen's face reddened. "He could have turned it off sooner," she insisted. "He wanted to humiliate me. That moat is a public nuisance." I spread my documentation on the table. "Here are the city regulations. My moat is within the maximum allowed depth. The water is circulated to prevent pests. The motor is below the maximum noise level. Additionally, I adhered to the HOA's guidelines for decorative water features. There's no mention anywhere of the word moat being forbidden. It's basically a shallow pond. I also have an engineering assessment from a licensed professional if you'd like to see it." A woman on the board, Joyce, flipped through my paperwork, nodding occasionally. She looked to Karen. "Do you have any evidence this moat violates specific rules or codes? Aside from your personal claim that it's a nuisance?" Karen faltered, flipping pages in her folder. She mumbled about the spirit of the community and how fortress-like structures degrade property values. Joyce frowned. That's subjective, not objective. I see no formal clause covering that exact scenario. If anything, this property is well maintained, and the water feature, while unconventional, is lawful." Thomas drummed his fingers on the table. "It's unfortunate this has turned into such a battle, but from the documentation presented, Ethan appears to be within his rights. The board can't force him to remove a compliant water feature. Regarding the entrapment accusation, the video suggests that was not the case. Unless anyone here has evidence to the contrary, we have to dismiss Karen's complaint." An uneasy silence filled the room. Karen looked ready to explode. She opened her mouth but closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "All right, I think we've heard enough. We'll finalize the resolution in writing, but for now, this matter is closed. Let's move on to the next agenda item." He paused. "Ethan, you're free to go." Relief surged through me. I gathered my materials and headed for the door, ignoring Karen's burning stare. I half expected her to say something spiteful on my way out, but she remained silent, perhaps too furious to speak. Exiting the building, I let out a long exhale. For the moment, I'd won. I'd never asked for a feud, but if Karen insisted on making me her target, she would have to reckon with the law and the truth, not just her personal whims. Yet I couldn't fully relax. Karen's obsession with controlling the neighborhood was legendary, and I suspected she wouldn't just slink away in defeat. Sure enough, the next challenge came sooner than I expected. A sabotaged mechanism on my drawbridge. About a week after the hearing, I returned home from a quick errand to find my drawbridge stuck halfway, the motor groaning as though jammed. I parked on the street and hurried over, alarmed to see wires yanked from the control box. My heart pounded as I realized someone had tampered with it. At first, I feared an outright burglary, but my house was untouched. It was just the drawbridge, my precious moat's critical piece, that had been vandalized. Curious, I called the local police to file a report. Although they took it seriously, they mentioned it was hard to prove who did it without security footage or witnesses. Right, security footage. I'd installed cameras around the side of my house to watch the perimeter of the moat, but ironically, the front angle near the motor's control box wasn't fully covered. I kicked myself for not being more thorough. That evening, I rewound the partial camera feed anyway. All it showed was a dark shape crossing briefly into the corner of the frame. No license plate, no clear face. I couldn't be certain it was Karen. It could have been a random vandal, but it felt too targeted. Why would anyone else sabotage my drawbridge? I spent the next few days fixing the damage with the help of Dave's instructions. The mechanical parts were intact, though the wiring needed replacement. Each time I crouched by the moat, I felt my anger rising. Karen had lost the formal battle, so it made sense she'd try an underhanded tactic to make me regret my choices. Even if I couldn't prove it, I couldn't imagine any other motive for someone messing with a driveway moat. Mary stopped by, her expression grim. "I heard about the vandalism. People are whispering that Karen's behind it," she said softly. "You gonna confront her?" I shrugged. Without evidence, there wasn't much to do. "I don't want to accuse her without proof," I replied, though my gut told me all I needed to know. Over the following week, the HOA circulated a memo about recent acts of vandalism. They urged residents to report suspicious activity, but didn't mention my moat by name. Meanwhile, Karen was eerily quiet. No more confrontations in person, no more notes on my door. I'd see her SUV pass by occasionally, always at a crawl, but she never got out. I expected a second act of sabotage, yet it never came. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to a semblance of normal. People got used to my moat, even found it entertaining. Kids riding bikes would slow down to gawk at the water, pointing at the small decorative plants. Some neighbors asked if it was high maintenance. I'd shrug and say, "It's not so bad, and it's worth it to have a driveway that's truly mine." The tension eased, but my guard stayed up. One evening, while double-checking the newly installed camera angles, I heard a knock at my door. It was Joyce, the more sympathetic board member who'd been at the hearing. She looked uneasy. "Can I come in?" she asked, so I ushered her to the living room. She explained that Karen had been filing repeated complaints with the board about random issues, fences, trash can placement, minor color discrepancies on shutters. "It's like she's searching for anything to get people in trouble," Joyce sighed. "Most of it's nonsense, but it's wearing the board down, and now others are speaking up about how Karen has harassed them. We might hold a special session to address her conduct." My eyebrows rose. "Really? I figured the board would just let her keep doing her thing to avoid conflict." Joyce shook her head. "There's too much mounting evidence. People are tired of her intimidation. Ethan, if you have any formal complaints, we need them. This could determine whether Karen stays on the board." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to lay out everything, from the driveway incidents to the moat fiasco to my suspicion she vandalized the drawbridge, but I only had concrete proof of the repeated trespassing and her attempt to misuse HOA rules. The vandalism was still an assumption, albeit a strong one. Eventually, I told Joyce about the repeated times she blocked my driveway, how she threatened me with baseless accusations, and how she trespassed onto my property to film. I offered the video from the day the drawbridge lifted. Joyce nodded, scribbling notes. "This is more than enough to bolster the case," Joyce said, standing up. "We'll keep you informed. Thank you for speaking up." After she left, I felt a cautious hope. Could the HOA finally be ready to curb Karen's abuses of power? Sure enough, a week later an announcement went out. A special HOA meeting to address misconduct within the board, open to all residents. The rumor mill spun wildly. People wondered if the board would remove Karen from her position. Others doubted anything would come of it, given her longtime connections. On the night of the meeting, the community clubhouse brimmed with neighbors. Taylor and I arrived early, spotting Mary near the front, saving us seats. Karen sat at the board's long table, arms folded, eyes scanning the crowd as if daring anyone to speak against her. Thomas, the HOA chair, called the meeting to order, then read a list of complaints lodged against Karen: improper use of authority, harassment, baseless citations, and intimidation tactics. The crowd stirred. Several people nodded, clearly having experienced her aggression themselves. One by one, individuals stood up to share their stories. A neighbor recounted how Karen placed a fine on them for an unapproved mailbox decal, only to find out no such rule existed. Another described how she'd forced them to remove a porch decoration she deemed gaudy. Mary chimed in about her bird feeder fiasco, and I spoke about the driveway battles, referencing the video evidence in the official hearing that dismissed Karen's claims. Karen sat in stony silence, occasionally rolling her eyes or shaking her head. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into a tirade about protecting property values and upholding standards. She claimed all her actions were motivated by a desire to keep the neighborhood pristine. But as she ranted, the crowd's collective frustration grew palpable. The board looked unconvinced. Thomas called for a board vote on whether to remove Karen from her position due to misconduct. The board, excluding Karen, briefly adjourned to a private room. Moments later, they returned, faces somber. Thomas cleared his throat. "We have decided by a majority vote to remove Karen from her role on the HOA board, effective immediately. Furthermore, we intend to review the complaint process to ensure no future misuse of authority." A small ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Karen's face turned scarlet. She looked around, searching for support but finding none. Without a word, she gathered her belongings and stomped out of the clubhouse. People exhaled in relief. Some high-fived or hugged. Mary winked at me, whispering, "Your moat might have pushed the dominoes. The rest of us were too scared to topple." I smiled, feeling the tension in my chest unwind. With Karen stripped of power, I hoped the feud would end. For a while it seemed it might. She stayed in the neighborhood but remained out of sight, no longer brandishing her authority. I carried on with life, enjoying the moat's unexpected charm. Even the new HOA board seemed friendlier, sending out newsletters that sounded more neighborly and less dictatorial. Yet part of me wondered if Karen would seek revenge in some quiet form. There was still the vandalism after all. Would she try something else? Fortunately, time passed with no further sabotage. I started to believe she'd let it go. Perhaps she realized she couldn't strong-arm everyone anymore. Maybe she was humbled, or maybe she just decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Months slipped by. The moat remained a novelty, and to my surprise it began to feel like a normal part of my home. I'd cross the drawbridge daily, a routine that once seemed ridiculous but now just felt like part of my morning and evening. Occasionally I'd catch kids peering over the stones to watch the small fish I'd introduced, a few hardy ones that thrived in shallow water. My neighbor Mary joked that I should charge for castle tours, referencing how the moat transformed my suburban home into a mini-fortress. Rick teased me about installing turrets next. Through it all, Taylor stood by me, equal parts amused and relieved that our biggest neighborhood conflict had subsided. Karen, to her credit, mostly disappeared from public view. Her house was up for sale within 6 months of her board removal. I heard through the grapevine that she planned to move closer to her sister. The day the sold sign appeared in her yard, I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. For all the misery she caused, I wondered if she'd been fighting her own private battles. That didn't justify her behavior, but it reminded me that sometimes people lash out because of personal unhappiness. One afternoon, as I was adding new stones along the moat's edge, a real estate agent and a couple of prospective buyers walked by. The agent laughed awkwardly when they noticed me. "Oh, this is the famous moat house," the agent said to them. My cheeks heated a bit, but I greeted them politely. If they had concerns, I'd answer them honestly. Instead, they seemed curious, almost charmed by the uniqueness of the property. "You certainly won't have anyone parking in your driveway uninvited," one of the buyers joked. I laughed. Exactly. Not long after Karen's house sold, moving trucks arrived. I didn't see her until the last day when she stood by her porch watching the movers load boxes. She looked tired, worn down by months of tension. We made brief eye contact across the street. I lifted a hand in a small wave, not of friendship, but maybe of closure. She gave a curt nod and stepped back inside. A few days later, she was gone. The new owners arrived, a friendly family who seemed happy to be part of the neighborhood. They even admired the moat, calling it ingenious. Life settled into a calm rhythm I'd almost forgotten could exist. With Karen out of the picture, the HOA restructured. They trimmed down some of the more draconian rules, focusing instead on fostering a supportive community. People felt freer to express themselves, whether through garden gnomes or colorful shutters. I also noticed more gatherings, block parties, group yard sales, events that used to be overshadowed by the fear of attracting petty complaints. It felt like a weight had lifted from the entire neighborhood. As for me, I recognized I'd embarked on a wild journey from the day I discovered Karen's SUV on my driveway. It started with frustration and escalated into a full-blown moat project. Yet that project became a symbol of standing up for oneself within the confines of the law. I hadn't broken any rules. I simply exploited the system in a creative way to protect my space. In doing so, I inadvertently helped others realize that Karen's intimidation wasn't invincible. One evening, while Taylor and I were sitting on our porch watching the sunset reflect on the water, she turned to me and said, "You know, for all the craziness this caused, I'm glad you did it. I've never seen you so determined. And hey, we ended up with a pretty unique yard feature." I chuckled, resting my arm around her shoulders. "Yeah, it's not every day you get to say you built a moat in suburban America to fend off a Karen. But I guess it worked." We clinked our glasses, savoring the quiet. The hum of the water pump and the gentle trickle along the stones were oddly soothing. I smiled at the idea that something born from annoyance could become a source of tranquility. A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying faint laughter from a neighbor's barbecue. The following weekend, Mary persuaded me to share the moat story in a neighborhood social media group. People had heard fragments, but many were curious about the details. So I wrote a lighthearted post recounting how repeated driveway blockages led to an unusual, perfectly legal solution. I ended by reminding everyone to stand up for their rights, but also keep a sense of humor. The response was overwhelmingly positive. with some praising the cleverness and others just relieved that the HOA tyrant was gone. In the months that followed, a few distant media outlets picked up the story. I received requests for interviews from local blogs and even a short human interest segment from a local news station. It felt surreal. I never sought fame. I just wanted my driveway back. But there I was, describing to a camera crew how I overcame a neighbor's harassment by constructing a miniature moat. Some found it hilarious, others inspiring. A few commenters online criticized it as overkill or excessive. But I was past caring about the naysayers. I'd found peace and reclaimed my space. Eventually, the noise surrounding my project died down. The moat simply became part of the neighborhood's landscape. My new neighbors across the street turned out to be lovely folks who had zero interest in petty feuds. The HOA, under new leadership, ran more smoothly, prioritizing actual community well-being rather than micromanaging everyone's lawn. I even enjoyed attending HOA meetings now, offering input about landscaping improvements and kids' play areas. Reflecting on the entire saga, I realized it wasn't just about Karen's SUV or even about a moat. It was about power, boundaries, and the lengths people will go to maintain or reclaim them. Karen's power rested on intimidation, on people's fear of confrontation and reprisal. By refusing to back down while still adhering to the rules, I challenged her. And once others saw that challenge succeed, they felt empowered too. Yes, building a moat might sound outrageous, but in the context of how HOAs can sometimes enable tyrannical behavior, it was strangely fitting. I used the system's own rigidity and legality to create a solution that made a bully powerless. I still giggle thinking about how many times Karen insisted I'd never get away with it, only to end up dethroned from the very board she used to lord over. One afternoon, about a year after Karen's departure, I glanced at my moat, noticing how the aquatic plants were flourishing. A pair of small frogs perched on a stone, as if guarding their miniature fortress. Children passed by, pointing excitedly, intrigued by the water and the possibility of glimpsing fish or frogs. If anyone had told me 2 years earlier that I'd be living in a place with a suburban moat, I'd have thought they were insane. Yet here we were, content and more united as a neighborhood than ever before. In the end, the biggest takeaway wasn't that moats are the ultimate solution to bad neighbors, though I guess they can be. It was that creative thinking, legal savvy, and community support can triumph over intimidation and spite. If someone tries to park on your metaphorical driveway, be it physically or emotionally, you have every right to set a boundary, to say no more. And sometimes that boundary might be an actual body of water. For those who followed this journey or stumbled upon it online, I hope it inspires you to stand up for yourself when faced with a bully. You don't have to build a moat, but you do have to find ways to protect what's yours. Maybe that means documenting every incident, rallying neighbors, or even running for the HOA board yourself. Whatever the method, the key is not to fold under unwarranted pressure. Today, I walk over that little drawbridge with a sense of pride and freedom. It's a daily reminder that I didn't let someone else dictate how I live in my own home. For a while, it looked like an outrageous stunt, and maybe it was, but given the outcome, I wouldn't change a thing. Standing here, gazing at the reflection of my porch lights on the water at night, I see more than a moat. I see the triumph of persistence over petty tyranny, and I smile, grateful that I turned a suburban nightmare into my own odd yet satisfying victory.